The biting Toronto wind was nothing compared to the cold settling in Naomi Vance's chest. The luxury restaurant was a blur behind her, along with Julian, the man who had abandoned her with a staggering bill and the humiliating sense that she was too much to handle. As a single mother to little Leo, time was her most expensive resource, and she had just wasted it on a total disaster. She sought refuge in Queen's Park, where the darkness was punctuated only by pale street lamps. That was when she saw him. A man in a sharp suit whose broad shoulders, which should have projected absolute power, shook in a devastating silence. He wasn't sobbing, he was simply letting the tears fall while staring into the void. Naomi should have kept walking, but loneliness recognizes loneliness. When she extended her handkerchief, her deep ebony skin contrasting with the white fabric, she had no idea she was touching the most dangerous man in the city. That night, fate decided that the perfect date of a lonely mother was a disaster, until fate led her to a crying Korean mafia boss. The life of Naomi Vance was a symphony of impeccable logistics and silent exhaustion. As a landscape architect in one of Canada's most cosmopolitan cities, she spent her days transforming arid plots into green sanctuaries for Toronto's elite. By night, she was the entire universe for Leo, a 5-year-old boy whose smile was the only thing keeping Naomi from succumbing to the fatigue that burned in her bones. Being a black single mother in a metropolis required an invisible armor. Naomi possessed a sculptural beauty, with deep ebony skin that was flawless and radiant under any light, and eyes that carried an ancestral wisdom. She was the rock of her family, the woman who solved everything, but who rarely had anyone to hold her hand when the silence of her apartment became too loud. Her best friend Sarah had insisted on the date. Julian is a promising lawyer, Naomi. He's cultured, stable, and finally someone who can keep up with your pace, Sarah had said. The date, however, was a brutal reminder of why Naomi had given up on looking for companionship. Julian spent 2 hours talking about his courtroom victories and his plans to buy a yacht, barely asking a single question about Naomi's life. When she mentioned Leo, Julian's expression shifted from feigned interest to ill-concealed disdain. In the middle of the main course, he received a text, claimed a last-minute emergency with a client, and vanished, leaving her with a bill of nearly $300 and a bitter void in her stomach. Naomi paid the bill, her dignity keeping her spine straight as she left the restaurant. She didn't want to go home yet and face the nanny's questions. She needed air. She needed to remind herself that she was strong enough to walk alone. Queen's Park was shrouded in a light mist. She walked the stone paths she knew so well until she spotted a figure on one of the most secluded benches. The man was sitting statically, but the aura around him was of an unbearable weight. He wore a charcoal grey suit, and his skin had a light bronze tone revealing his Korean heritage. His features were aristocratic and cold, the kind of face that would intimidate most people at first glance. But there, under the yellowish light of the lamppost, Naomi saw only fragility. Tears flowed silent, tracing shiny paths on his face as he stared at nothing, as if he were watching the end of his own world. Naomi, moved by an empathy that often surpassed her caution, approached. She felt a strange vibration in the air, a tension suggesting that this man was dangerous even when he was vulnerable. "My perfect date was a complete disaster, but I think your day is managing to be worse than mine," she said, her voice rich and deep, with the characteristic smoothness of her Jamaican roots. Seo Jun did not flinch. He moved his face slowly, focusing his obsidian eyes on her. He studied her for a moment, the intensity of his gaze making Naomi feel a sudden heat. He was not used to being interrupted, and certainly not by a woman who exhaled such strength and calm at the same time. "You shouldn't be walking alone in a park at this hour," he said. The voice was a deep, controlled baritone, carries with a natural authority that made the hair on Naomi's arms stand up. Naomi did not back down. She sat on the opposite end of the bench and extended a linen handkerchief. "I'm a mother to a 5-year-old boy. I deal with emotional crises before breakfast, but usually the reason is a broken toy, not something that makes a man like you hide in the dark." Seo Jun looked at the handkerchief and then at her hand. The contrast of Naomi's deep ebony skin against the white fabric was of a beauty that distracted him for a second from his own agony. He accepted the handkerchief, and the brush of his fingers sent an electric shock through both of them. "Thank you," he murmured, wiping his face with precise gestures. And you're right. My day was unbearable. Want to share the weight? I'm a stranger. Tomorrow I'll just be a memory, and you can go back to being whoever you are when you're not crying in a park. Seo-jun let out a heavy sigh, something he would never allow himself to do in front of his subordinates. Today marks 3 years since my younger brother died. He was the only person who cared about who I was before I had to become what I am now. Grief is like a tide, Naomi said softly. Sometimes it recedes and you can breathe. Other times, like today, it comes with force and tries to drown you, but you're still here. They sat in silence for a long time, watching the mist dance between the trees. To Seo-jun, this woman was an enigma. To Naomi, this man was a wounded soul. Finally, he stood up, his posture regaining the rigidity of a leader who commands silent armies. I need to go. Thank you for the handkerchief. And the company, Naomi. She frowned, surprised. How do you know my name? He gave an enigmatic half-smile, the spark of power returning to his eyes. You dropped your professional card at the restaurant. I was at the next table when your companion fled. He was a fool. Before she could respond, he disappeared into the darkness, where 2 black cars awaited him with engines running. 3 days later, Naomi's world collided with his again. A man in a grey suit, with a look that seemed to scan for threats in every shadow, appeared at her office with a contract worth more than an entire year's revenue for her company. Mr. Han wishes for you to design the private garden of his new residence, said the assistant, Min-ho. The following afternoon, Naomi drove to the indicated address in Bridle Path. The mansion was a minimalist structure of glass and stone, protected by high walls and cutting-edge technology. Upon entering the property, she saw Seo-jun standing near an area where the grass was dead and the soil seemed to suffer. He wasn't in a suit today. He wore a black polo shirt fitted to his body, which emphasized his broad shoulders and muscular chest. The short sleeves revealed what Naomi hadn't seen in the park. On his right arm, an intricate Maori tattoo stretched from shoulder to elbow, the dark geometric patterns appearing to vibrate against his light skin. It was a warrior's mark, a fascinating contrast to the luxury around him. Mr. Han, she said, her clipboard pressed against her chest, as her eyes inevitably traced the details of the tattoo and the physical strength he emanated. It seems you have a private desert for me to solve. He turned, and the look he threw at her was like a physical touch. I want a meditation garden, Naomi, something that honors the memory we discussed, and I want it built with the same honesty you showed that night. Naomi walked the grounds, feeling the weight of the security guards who watched her every move from a distance. Building something like this requires trust, and it requires you to let me into your space, Mr. Han. Seo-jun took a step toward her. The scent of sandalwood and something metallic enveloped her. He crossed his arms, making the muscles of his right arm, marked by the Maori tattoo, bulge. You already entered my space the moment you offered me that handkerchief. Now, the work is just a formality to keep you close. Naomi felt a flutter in her stomach that wasn't fear, but a dangerous attraction. Is the budget unlimited? Money is the only thing I have in abundance, Naomi. What I don't have is peace, and my instinct tells me you're the only person in Toronto capable of giving me that. As they discussed technical details, a movement at the mansion's entrance caught Naomi's attention. A convoy of black vehicles entered the courtyard, and men with lethal expressions disembarked. Seo-jun didn't look away from her, but his jaw tightened. Min-ho will finalize the papers with you, said Seo-jun, his voice suddenly becoming cold and distant. I have matters that don't belong in a garden. As Naomi was escorted out, she saw Seo-jun walk toward the men. He no longer looked like the man crying in the park. He looked like a king departing for war. Passing through the main gate, she noticed a man inside one of the arriving cars, a man with cold eyes who watched her with predatory curiosity. She was a single mother and an architect who only wanted stability for her son. But as she looked in the rearview mirror and saw the figure of Seo-jun with his tattooed arm and his black shirt, disappearing inside that fortress of secrets, Naomi knew the garden was just the beginning. She was planting flowers in Mafia soil, and the roots might very well pull her under. The routine at the Bridle Path mansion became the new axis of Naomi's life. Every morning, after dropping Leo off at school, she swapped her dress shoes for sturdy work boots and drove to Seo-jun's glass fortress. The Memorial Garden project wasn't just a job, it had become a technical obsession. She spent hours analyzing soil acidity and light incidence, trying to create an ecosystem that would survive Toronto's relentless winter, just as Seo-jun seemed to survive his own coldness. Her deep ebony skin glowed under the pale morning sun, and she moved with an efficient grace among the workers she had hired. Naomi was a master of her craft. She didn't just plant flowers, she sculpted sensory experiences. For Seo-jun's memorial, she had chosen white birches, whose pale trunks would bring a spectral serenity to the space, and tall grasses that would whisper with the wind. Seo-jun, however, was the variable she couldn't calculate. He rarely left the house during the heaviest working hours, but Naomi felt his gaze. Through the immense glass walls of the living room, she saw his motionless silhouette. He was often in his black polo shirt, arms crossed, the Maori tattoo on his right arm serving as a visual reminder that behind that businessman facade, there was a warrior who carried deep marks. On Tuesday of the second week, the unforeseen happened. Mrs. Bennett called to warn that Leo's school had closed early due to a gas leak and that she needed to take her own daughter to the doctor. With no immediate support network, Naomi had no choice. "Hey champ, you're going to be my assistant today," she told Leo as she buckled him into his car seat. Arriving at the mansion, Naomi felt a pang of anxiety. She didn't know how a man like Seo-jun would react to a child invading his sanctuary of silence. But the gate opened as usual, and Minho received her with the same inscrutable expression, though his eyes softened for a microsecond upon seeing little Leo. "Mr. Han is in the office," Minho informed. "He knows the boy is here." Naomi settled Leo in a safe area of the garden, handing him a toy digging set. "Stay here near the birches, Leo. Mommy needs to check the drainage." Leo, with his infinite curiosity, didn't stay still for long. While Naomi discussed with the site foreman, the boy followed a blue butterfly that led him straight to the marble terrace, where Seo-jun was sitting, reading documents. Naomi realized too late. Her heart raced when she saw Leo stop just inches from Seo-jun, staring at the Maori tattoo on the man's arm with wide eyes. "Wow, is it a map?" Leo asked, his small voice echoing in the silence of the terrace. Naomi ran, her boots clicking against the marble. "Leo, I'm so sorry, Mr. Han, She stopped. Seo-jun didn't look annoyed. He had lowered the documents and leaned forward, getting down to Leo's level. His obsidian eyes, which Naomi rarely saw relaxed, were now fixed on the boy with a sweetness that left her breathless. "It's not a map, little one," said Seo-jun, his baritone voice dropping to a soft tone Naomi had never heard. "It's a story. Every line here represents a battle or a promise." Leo reached out his small hand, and Seo-jun didn't flinch. The boy touched the light skin of his arm, tracing one of the geometric patterns. "My mommy says plants tell stories too." Seo-jun looked at Naomi over Leo's head. His gaze was intense, but it wasn't the lethal intensity she had seen days before. It was something deeper, a silent acknowledgement that he saw in her not just the architect, but the dedicated mother whose deep, ebony skin seemed to radiate a protective strength. "Your mother is very wise," Seo-jun replied. He then looked at Naomi. "He can stay. Minho will bring a snack for him." For the next 2 hours, Naomi witnessed something impossible. Han Seo-jun, the man who commanded the port of Toronto with an iron fist, allowed Leo to sit on the floor of his terrace, helping him organize his papers with stones the boy had found in the garden. Seo-jun answered every one of Leo's incessant questions with infinite patience, treating the boy with a dignity Julian would never dream of offering. At sunset, the construction site was empty of workers. Golden light bathed the garden, and the air smelled of fresh earth and sandalwood. Naomi was finishing cleaning her tools when Seo-jun approached, carrying Leo, who had already fallen asleep in the man's strong arms. The contrast was overwhelming. Seo-jun's tattooed arm wrapped around Leo's small body with absolute delicacy. He handed the boy to Naomi, and the moment their bodies touched during the transfer was charged with static electricity. Naomi's skin, dark and vibrant, brushed against his, cool and firm. "He's a good boy, Naomi," said Seo-jun, his voice low so as not to wake the child. "You raised him well." "He's my world," she replied, adjusting Leo's weight. "Thank you for not minding. I know this is a place of business." Seo-jun took a step forward, narrowing the distance between them. In the twilight, Naomi realized something her ability to read micro-expressions had been picking up for days. Seo-jun was exhausted. It wasn't the physical fatigue of someone who worked hard, but the constant alert of a prey that knows it is being hunted. His eyes scanned the garden perimeter every few minutes, so even while talking to her. "What scares you, Seo-jun?" she asked, the boldness of the question surprising both of them. He hesitated, silence stretched, filled only by the distant sound of Toronto traffic. He looked at the garden she was building, at the birches that symbolized the brother he couldn't save. "What scares me is that this garden becomes the only place where I can be myself," he confessed, "and that when it's finished, you'll have no reason to come back." Naomi felt her heart accelerate. The romantic tension was palpable, an invisible thread pulling her to him. "I'm a landscape architect, Mr. Han. My job is to ensure things take root. If the garden is well cared for, it will always need me." Seo-jun raised his hand, hesitating for a second before gently touching Naomi's cheek. His thumb traced the contour of her jaw, her flawless skin responding to his touch with an immediate shiver. "I want to take care of it, but there are things in this soil you haven't seen yet." "I see more than you think," Naomi countered, holding his gaze. "I see a man who cries for a brother, and who has patience with a child he's never seen before. The rest is just what you use to protect yourself." Seo-jun withdrew his hand, his expression hardening slightly when the radio on Minho's belt, which was a few meters away, crackled. "Denial is a powerful tool, Naomi. Use it carefully," he said, his tone returning to being enigmatic and distant. "The investor dinner next week. Minho will send a formal invitation. I want you there to present the Memorial Garden project. It will be the first step toward making this property something legitimate." Naomi agreed, but as she walked to her car with Leo in her lap, she couldn't stop thinking about his words. Legitimate. The word suggested that what existed now wasn't. She looked back and saw Seo-jun standing on the terrace, a solitary figure in his black shirt, his tattoo merging with the shadows beginning to swallow the house. Arriving home and putting Leo to bed, Naomi sat on the balcony of her apartment. She thought of the way Seo-jun had looked at Leo. There was a hunger for normalcy in those obsidian eyes, a desire to belong to a world of simple colors and children's laughter. But she also remembered how he scanned the shadows. She was falling for a man who lived in a state of permanent war, but the most dangerous thing was that she was beginning to believe she could be his peace. She didn't know that in Lee Dong-hai's office, Seo-jun's rival, photos of her and Leo in the mansion garden were already being spread across an oak table. Dong-hai didn't need guns or kidnappings. He only needed an opportunity to show the world, and the Architecture Ethics Board, that Naomi Vance was sleeping with the enemy. The Toronto rain had its own rhythm, a persistent beat against glass and metal that turned the Bridle Path mansion into an isolated island from the rest of the world. The memorial garden was almost finished. The white birches now stood like silent sentinels, and the riverstones Naomi had manually selected formed a winding path leading to the center of the refuge. Naomi was kneeling in the damp earth, finalizing the planting of dark irises around the base of a minimalist stone sculpture. She worked with surgical precision, her hands moving with the confidence of someone who knows the language of the earth. Sweat mixed with the fine drizzle on her face, and her deep ebony skin glowed under the gray evening light. She was exhausted, but there was a visceral satisfaction in seeing the chaos of the land transform into order and beauty. "You work as if you were healing something," Seo-jun's voice echoed behind her, deep and sudden. Naomi did not startle. She had already learned to recognize his presence before even hearing him. It was a weight in the air, a change in atmospheric pressure that always indicated he was nearby. She stood up, wiping her hands on her canvas apron, and turned to face him. He was standing under the terrace eaves, watching her. There were no papers in his hands, nor Minho's radio nearby. For a rare moment, he seemed disarmed of his responsibilities. "Gardening is a form of reparation, Seo-jun," she replied, approaching the terrace to take shelter from the rain. "You take out what's dead. Prepare the soil and give something new a chance to survive. It's the closest we get to a fresh start." Seo-jun watched her in silence for a long moment. His obsidian eyes scanned her face, lingering on the small smudge of earth on her cheek. Without saying a word, he stepped forward. Naomi held her breath as he raised his hand. With his thumb, He wiped the dirt from her flawless skin, a gesture so intimate and charged with an unexpected tenderness that her heart skipped a beat. "And what are you trying to heal in yourself, Naomi?" he asked, his voice now a husky whisper that seemed to vibrate against her skin. "The idea that I have to carry the whole world alone," she confessed, honesty escaping before she could filter it. "Being a mother, being a professional. Sometimes I forget what it's like to just exist without a contingency plan." Seo-jun nodded slowly, his fingers still lightly brushing her jaw. "I understand. The contingency plan is what keeps us alive, but it's also what prevents us from feeling the weight of what truly matters." He led her inside to the vast marble kitchen where the scent of ginger tea and sandalwood hung in the air. Min-ho had already prepared everything before retiring to the security post. Seo-jun poured tea for both, and they sat in front of the large windows, watching the storm gain strength outside. For the first time, the conversation wasn't about the garden or deadlines. Naomi told him about her childhood in Jamaica, about the smell of the sea, and the strength of the women in her family who taught her that dignity was her most precious possession. Seo-jun, in turn, talked about Seoul, not about the organization, but about the winter nights when he and Seo-yoon shared a bowl of ramyun in a tiny apartment, dreaming of a future where they wouldn't have to fight to survive. "I made promises to him, Naomi," said Seo-jun, his gaze fixed on the rain. "I promised I would take him away from the darkness, but darkness has long roots. As I climbed, the soil under my feet got dirtier. You can still be the light for someone, Seo-jun, even if your hands had to dig in the mud to build this place." The emotional connection between them was now a tense, vibrating thread. Naomi saw beyond the mask of the feared boss. She saw the man who still held grief like a sacred treasure, and Seo-jun saw in her the anchor he never knew he needed. The romantic tension reached its peak when Seo-jun stood up and walked to her. He stopped just inches away, his presence emanating a magnetic heat. Naomi lifted her face, meeting his gaze. In that moment, there were no differences of worlds, no mafia or architecture. There was only the inevitable attraction between two lonely souls who recognized each other in the dark. He touched her face with both hands, his light skin contrasting stunningly with her deep ebony skin. Seo-jun leaned in, his lips millimeters from hers. Naomi could feel his breath, the scent of tea and the subtle danger that always accompanied him. "I shouldn't want you to stay," he whispered against her lips. "I should send you away right now, to your world of flowers and light." "But you won't," she replied, her voice firm despite the tremor in her hands, "because you know I'm not afraid of the dark." The kiss was a collision of need and restraint. It was desperate and deep, a silent confession of everything they couldn't say aloud. Naomi felt the strength of his arms around her, protecting and holding her at the same time. It was a kiss that carried the weight of 1,000 difficult choices and the promise of something neither was prepared to admit. When they pulled apart, both were breathless. Seo-jun leaned his forehead against hers, eyes closed. "The gala event is in 3 days, Naomi. It will be the official opening of the Seo-yoon Memorial Foundation. All of Toronto's eyes will be on us." "I'll be there," she promised. "Be prepared," he warned, his voice regaining the cadence of authority. "People like Lee Dong-hae don't see a garden as a tribute. They see it as a weakness. He will try to find a crack in your armor. Naomi, he will try to use your integrity against you." Naomi smiled, an expression of determination that lit up her face. "My integrity isn't armor, Seo-jun. It's my soil, and nothing grows in soil that isn't solid." The following days were a blur of preparations. Naomi chose a dress that was a statement of power and elegance, liquid silk in a deep emerald green that enhanced the radiance of her skin. She wouldn't wear excessive jewelry, only the confidence of someone who knew exactly who she was. Seo-jun, on the other hand, was plunged into tense meetings. Naomi saw him from afar, talking to men who looked like shadows under the light of day. She realized the gala event wasn't just a tribute to his brother, but a strategic maneuver by Seo-jun to move his businesses into the light, to become legitimate and perhaps to create a world where he could stay with her, without the constant shadows. The night before the event, Sarah went to Naomi's apartment. While Leo slept, the two friends shared a bottle of wine. "Naomi, I see the way you look at the phone when he calls," Sarah said, concerned. "This man, He's not like Julian or any other guy in Toronto. There's something about him that makes me want to lock the doors." "I know he's dangerous, Sarah," Naomi admitted, looking at her own hands. "But it's not the kind of danger you're thinking of. His danger is that he makes me feel like I don't have to be strong all the time. He sees the real me. Just be careful not to get lost in his garden," Sarah warned. "The most beautiful flowers often have the most poisonous thorns." That night, Naomi had trouble sleeping. She thought of the kiss, of Seojun's touch, and the vulnerability he had shown under the rain. She felt she was on the edge of an abyss, but for the first time in her life she wasn't worried about the fall. She was worried about what she would find down there. Meanwhile, in a hotel suite downtown, Lee Dong-hae reviewed the guest list for the gala. He stopped at Naomi Vance's name and smiled at his assistant. "She's perfect," said Dong-hae, his voice dripping with polite poison. "Seojun thinks he can buy respectability by planting a few trees." He forgot that Toronto's Architecture Ethics Board is much more relentless than any court. Tomorrow we're going to show Ms. Vance that the scent of Seojun's flowers is actually the smell of rot. The stage was set. Naomi Vance, the single mother who had built her life on truth, was about to enter a viper's nest where truth was the most dangerous commodity of all. And Han Seojun, the man who wanted to change for her, would discover that the past cannot be buried only with earth and flowers. Sometimes it needs to be faced with blood and sacrifice. The grand ballroom of the Fairmont Royal York was a sea of crystal, silk, and whispered power. Toronto's elite moved through the space with the practiced ease of those who owned the air they breathed. Naomi stood at the entrance, her deep ebony skin glowing against the emerald silk of her dress. She felt the weight of every gaze in the room, but her spine remained straight, her chin held high with the dignity of a woman who had earned her place. Seojun was across the room, surrounded by politicians and port authorities. He wore a perfectly tailored dark suit that made him look every bit the legitimate tycoon he aspired to be. But as Naomi watched him, she saw the iron dog beneath the surface, the way he never turned his back to a door, the way his obsidian eyes constantly scanned the perimeter. Before she could reach him, a man intercepted her. He was elegant, with a smile that was too perfect to be sincere, and eyes that were as cold as Lake Ontario in January. "Ms. Vance, I presume," he said, bowing slightly. "Lee Dong-hae, I've heard so much about your restorative gardening." "Mr. Dong-hae," Naomi replied, her voice steady. "I wasn't aware that the logistics of the port included an interest in landscape architecture." Dong-hae chuckled. "Does sound like dry leaves on pavement. We all have our hobbies. Mine happens to be the preservation of integrity in our city's development. It would be a tragedy if such a talented professional were to be tarnished by unsavory associations." "If you have something to say, Mr. Dong-hae, say it clearly. I don't have time for metaphors." Dong-hae's smile sharpened. "Very well. Do you know where the $4 million for your memorial foundation came from, Ms. Vance? It didn't come from shipping fees. It came from a series of shell companies linked to the Iron Dog's enforcement of port tariffs. Tariffs paid in blood and intimidation. By accepting this contract, you aren't just planting trees. You're laundering the reputation of a man who would burn this city to the ground if it meant he could sit on the ashes." Naomi felt the world tilt. She looked at Seojun, who was now walking toward them, his expression hardening as he saw her with Dong-hae. "Is there a problem here?" Seojun asked, his voice a low growl that caused several nearby guests to step back. "No problem at all, Seojun," Dong-hae said, raising his glass. "I was just congratulating Ms. Vance on her work. It's remarkable how much dirt a little greenery can hide. I've already sent a dossier to the Architecture Ethics Board regarding the funding of the project. I'm sure they'll find your legitimacy as fascinating as I do." Dong-hae moved away, leaving a silence that felt heavier than lead. Naomi looked at Seojun, her obsidian eyes searching his for a denial that didn't come. "Naomi, let's go to the terrace," Seojun said, reaching for her arm. She pulled back. "Is it true, Seojun? Did you use me to make your money look clean?" "It's not that simple," he whispered, his jaw tight. "I am moving everything to the light. The foundation is real. The memorial is real. But the money is stained," Naomi realized, her voice trembling not with fear but with a deep, visceral hurt. "You knew what my license means to me. You knew that I built my reputation on being untouchable. You didn't just hire me for a garden. You hired me for my soul." I hired you because you were the only person who saw me, he hissed, his obsidian eyes flashing with a desperate intensity. I wanted to build something that mattered, something that you would be proud of. I can't be proud of a lie, Seo-jun, and I won't let you drown Leo in this. The confrontation was interrupted by a commotion near the stage. An announcement was being made, but Naomi didn't stay to hear it. She turned and ran through the ballroom, the emerald silk of her dress billowing behind her like a dying flame. She spent the next 48 hours in a state of hyper-alertness. Every car that passed her apartment felt like a threat. Every email from the ethics board felt like a death sentence. She looked at Leo, playing on the floor with his toy trucks, and felt a crushing guilt. She had allowed the iron dog into their lives. And now the shadows were stretching over them. Seo-jun tried to call, but she didn't answer. He sent Minho to her door with a folder, but she didn't open it. She was done with the denial selectiva. She was done with the beautiful garden built on top of a graveyard. On the third day, the ethics board summoned her. The meeting was cold and clinical. They presented the evidence provided by Dong Hai. Naomi sat there, her deep ebony skin pale with stress, and told them the truth. She had been hired to build a memorial. She had performed her duties, and she had been unaware of the illicit origins of the funds. But she knew that in their eyes her association with Seo-jun was enough to end her career. When she left the building, Seo-jun was waiting by her car. He wasn't in a suit. He was in his black polo shirt, looking more like the warrior she had seen in the garden than the tycoon from the gala. "I've settled it," he said, his voice flat. "What did you settle, Seo-jun? You can't bribe the ethics board." "I didn't bribe them, I gave them Dong Hai. I provided evidence of his own money laundering schemes that were far more extensive than anything I've done. In exchange for the full cooperation of the Han organization in a federal investigation, your name has been cleared. The ethics board will issue a statement saying you were a victim of corporate misinformation." Naomi stared at him. "You're cooperating with the feds? Seo-jun? That's suicide in your world. It's the only way to become truly legitimate, Naomi. I'm dismantling the enforcement arm of the organization. I'm turning the port operations over to a public trust. I'm walking away from the Iron Dog title. Why?" Seo-jun stepped closer, his presence as overwhelming as ever. "Because I realized that the only thing I truly want to own is a seat on that bench in the park, and I want you to be sitting there with me." Naomi felt a tear escape and roll down her cheek. "I can't go back to the garden, Seo-jun. It's tainted for me." "Then we won't go back. I've sold the house. The garden will be donated to the city as a public park, the Seo-yun Memorial Park. It will be yours to manage under a city contract, not mine. You'll be the one to ensure it stays clean." Naomi looked at him, seeing the sacrifice in his eyes. He was giving up his empire to save her reputation. He was choosing the light, even if it meant being a target for the rest of his life. "You really are a disaster, aren't you?" she whispered, a small, sad smile touching her lips. "The best disaster you ever met," he replied, reaching out to take her hand. They stood there in the parking lot, the Toronto skyline looming over them. The crisis wasn't over. Lee Dong-hai's people would be looking for blood, and the transition to a legitimate life would be long and dangerous. But for the first time, the négation sélective was gone. They saw each other for exactly who they were. A mother who would do anything for her son, and a man who was willing to lose everything to be worthy of her. "Leo misses you," she said softly. Seo-jun's expression softened instantly. "I miss him too. I bought him a new set of trucks, the ones with the working cranes. No more gifts, Seo-jun, just you. If you're going to be in our lives, you have to be there as a man, not as a provider of luxury." "I can do that," he promised. "I've spent my whole life being a boss. I think I'm ready to try being a partner." As they drove away, Naomi looked out the window at the city. She knew the path ahead would be difficult. There would be no more bridle path mansions or limitless budgets, but as she felt the warmth of Seo-jun's hand on hers, she knew that the soil they were planting in now was finally solid. The flowers they grew from here on out would be real, rooted in a truth that no rival could ever take away. The transition from the shadows to the light was not a sudden burst, but a slow, grueling climb. For Han Seo-jun, dismantling an empire was harder than building one. For Naomi Vance, rebuilding a reputation required a meticulousness that tested her spirit. In the months following the gala, Toronto watched in fascination as the Han organization's hold on the port dissolved into a transparent public trust. Lee Dong-hai's fall was swift and brutal. The evidence Seo-jun provided was a death blow to his rival's carefully constructed facade. But with Dong-hai gone, a power vacuum was created, and Seo-jun spent his nights ensuring that no one more dangerous took his place while he made his exit. Naomi remained his anchor. She didn't return to the mansion, which was now being prepared for its new life as a public space. Instead, she stayed in her modest apartment, focusing on her work and on Leo. She and Seo-jun saw each other in quiet cafes, in parks, and in the small moments of a normal life that he had never known. One Saturday afternoon, Seo-jun arrived at Naomi's door. He was dressed casually, a far cry from the iron dog of the past. He looked younger, the lines of tension around his obsidian eyes having softened. "Are you ready?" he asked as Leo ran to him, jumping into his arms. "Ready for what?" Naomi asked, smiling as she watched Seo-jun spin her son around. "To see the park. The city finalized the transfer today. It's officially the Seo-yun Memorial Park." They drove to Bridle Path. The high walls had been replaced by elegant iron fencing that allowed the neighborhood to see the greenery within. The security guards were gone, replaced by city park rangers. As they walked through the gates, Naomi felt a sense of peace she hadn't expected. The birches she had planted were thriving, their white trunks gleaming in the afternoon sun. The path of river stones was smooth and welcoming. "You did it, Naomi," Seo-jun said, standing beside her as Leo ran toward the grass. "You turned a fortress into a sanctuary." "We did it," she corrected. "You had to let go of the fortress first." They sat on a bench identical to the one in Queen's Park where they had first met. Seo-jun took her hand, his thumb tracing the patterns of her palm. "I had a meeting with the federal authorities this morning," he confided. "My cooperation is complete. I'm officially a private citizen now, no more Iron Dog, just Han Seo-jun." "And what will Han Seo-jun do with his time?" "He's going to invest in legitimate logistics consulting, and he's going to spend a lot of time learning about Jamaican landscape architecture. I hear it's quite beautiful." Naomi laughed, a bright, clear sound that seemed to make the birches sway. "It is, but it's very different from Toronto." "I'm a quick learner," he said, pulling her closer. The romantic tension that had been a wildfire between them had matured into a steady, warming flame. There was no more mystery or négation sélective. They knew the scars each carried, and they had chosen to love them. As the sun began to set, casting long shadows across the park, Naomi looked at the sculpture she had placed at the center of the garden. It was a simple block of granite with a single word carved into it in both English and Korean: hope. "Seo-yun would have loved this," Seo-jun whispered. "He does love it," Naomi said. "Every time a child runs on this grass, or a person finds a moment of peace here, his memory lives on." The resolution of their journey wasn't a perfect cinematic ending. There were still legal hurdles to clear, and Seo-jun would always have to be careful of those from his past. But as they walked out of the park, hand in hand, with Leo skipping ahead of them, Naomi felt a profound sense of rightness. She had been a lonely mother on a disastrous date, and he had been a man drowning in his own power. Fate had brought them together in a moment of shared grief, and through the creation of a garden, they had found a way to create a life. "Naomi," Seo-jun said, stopping her just before they reached the car. "Yes?" He reached into his pocket and pulled out a small, simple ring, not a diamond of mafia-level excess, but a band of gold with a small emerald. "I don't want to buy your soul, Naomi. I just want to be the soil you grow in. Will you marry me?" Naomi looked at the ring, then at the man who had sacrificed everything to be worthy of her. Her deep ebony skin glowed in the twilight, and her eyes filled with tears of joy. "Yes, Seo-jun, I will." He slid the ring onto her finger, and they kissed, a kiss that was no longer about desperation, but about a future they would build together, one day at a time in the light. 18 months later. The air in the Seo-yun Memorial Park was filled with the scent of blooming jasmine and the laughter of children. It had become one of Toronto's most beloved hidden gems, a place where the city's frantic pace seemed to slow down to a crawl. Naomi Vance Hahn stood on the terrace of the small pavilion she had designed, watching as a group of architecture students sketched the birches. Her career had not only recovered but flourished. She was now known as the woman who could find the heart of any space and make it beat again. Her skin, deep ebony and impeccable, was radiant in the afternoon sun. "Mommy, look, I found a ladybug," Leo shouted, running toward her. He was taller now, his face full of the same boundless energy, but with a new sense of security. Behind him walked Seo-jun. He looked relaxed, his black polo shirt showing the Maori tattoo on his arm that Leo still insisted was a map to a secret treasure. Seo-jun had become a successful consultant, his expertise in logistics now serving legitimate global trade. But more importantly, he had become the father Leo needed and the partner Naomi deserved. "He's been chasing that ladybug for 10 minutes, Seo-jun said, wrapping an arm around Naomi's waist. He kissed her temple, a gesture of easy, settled affection. "He gets his persistence from you," she teased, "and his eye for detail from you." They looked out over the park together. The birches were strong, their roots deep and secure in the soil they had prepared with such care. The shadows of the past were still there, but they no longer had the power to chill the present. "You saved my life that night in the park, Naomi," Seo-jun said softly, his obsidian eyes reflecting the peace they had built. "No," she replied, leaning her head against his shoulder. "We saved each other. I was just a lonely mother on a bad date, remember? And I was just a man waiting for someone to offer me a handkerchief." As the sun set over Toronto, they stood together in the garden they had created, a sanctuary built on truth, nurtured by love, and destined to bloom for a lifetime.